People throughout history have practiced slavery, from biblical times to ancient Egypt. Even sadly, this is still practiced today. Over time, the institution of slavery has been forbidden in regions after regions in the world. By the year 1820, for example, the African slave trade was illegal to all Spanish subjects. This was brought to the judicial table in 1839, when the U.S. Navy, near Long Island, New York, seized a schooner by the name of La Amistad. After the capture of the ship, the United States Navy, Cuban buyers and sellers, and Spain's Queen Isabella II thought the vessel and Africans on board belonged in their possession. Consequently, there was much confusion and many different opinions among these parties until the Supreme Court made the ruling of the case in 1841. Our story does not begin in the courts. The story of the Amistad starts in West Africa. Around 500 to 600 Africans were abducted and sold to the Portuguese by Pedro Blanco. These captured Africans, after being taken from their tribes, were put on the Ticora, sold into the transatlantic slave trade. This slave ship sailed to Havana, Cuba. The surviving Africans were sold in Cuba and falsely labeled as Cuban-born slaves. The two Spaniards, by the names of Pedro Montez and Jose Ruiz, purchased 53 Africans. The two men insured the 49 adult African males and 4 African children and loaded them on the Amistad. The vessel started a journey to Guanaja, but the vessel was put off course on the third night. The third night, a 25-year-old African led a revolt against the crew of the Amistad. The leader, Sangpe, was known to the Spaniards as Cinque. Cinque was the son of a Mende headman. He had been a rice farmer and trader in the village of Mani before being abducted and sold by Pedro Blanco. During the uprising, the cook of the vessel and owner-captain, Ramon Ferrer, were killed by the Africans. Montez, Ruiz, and Ferrer's slave, Antonio, were the only crew members not killed in the revolt. Trying to sail back to Africa, the Africans accidentally sailed north in a zigzag pattern to New York. 63 days after the mutiny, the USS Washington seized La Amistad near Montauk Point, Long Island, New York. As the vessel was about to be seized by the Navy ship, Cinque and a few other Africans were on shore gathering supplies when they met Captain Henry Green and some of his seamen. Trying to communicate, the Africans asked Green to take them back to his homeland. Without any progress, the Africans returned to the ship and were seized by the USS Washington. Lieutenant Richard W. Meade was the Navy officer in charge of the Washington when the Amistad was seized on August 26, 1839. Meade and the other commanding officer, Gidney, towed the schooner back to New London Harbor in Connecticut. On August 29th, Judge Andrew T. Judson held a hearing on the Washington in the harbor. The Africans were held in New Haven jail with charges of mutiny and murder. This was the beginning of our historical case, La Amistad. Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montez bought the Africans in Cuba and thought they should be the true owners of the slaves and vessel. The two Spaniards from Cuba said that the 49 adult males belonged to Ruiz and the 4 children to Montez because they had insured them when purchased. Ruiz insured the 49 adult males for $20,000, while Montez paid insurance of $1,300 for the 4 children. Dr. Richard Robert Madden, a British officer stationed in Havana, broke this option in the case when he shared his knowledge with the court. Madden proved the papers Ruiz and Montez submitted to the court as legal documents of ownership were fraud. By looking at the papers, he noticed that the Africans were labeled as Ladinos. Ladinos were slaves who were native Africans, but enslaved in Cuba prior to 1820. This was a common practice, but impossible for the slaves of the Amistad. 4 of these Africans were only children, and not born before the year 1820, proving that the Africans were not Cuban slaves. Africans who are not considered slaves could not be considered property. After this ruling, Ruiz and Montez were charged with assault, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. Spain and Queen Isabella II were also on the side of the Spaniards from Cuba before Dr. Madden destroyed the case. Spanish Foreign Minister Ángel Calderón de la Barca said that holding the schooner and slaves or property was a violation of the Treaty of 1795. Because of this so-called violation, Spain wanted 4 things. 1. The Amistad and everything on board was to be returned to the owner without salvage payments to any of the other parties. 2. the U.S. did not have the right to institute proceedings against or impose penalties upon subjects of Spain for crimes committed on a Spanish ship in Spanish waters. 3. The Negroes were to be taken back to Havana and tried by Spanish law for violations. And 4. If these requests were delayed by means of intervention by the authorities of Connecticut, the owners of the vessel or slaves should be insured for any injury that may occur to them. After the testimony of Dr. Madden and the imprisonment of Ruiz and Montes, it was determined that the Africans were not property of the two Spaniards. Therefore, Pinckney's treaty did not apply to this case. After learning of the situation that happened on board, Captain Gidney secured the Negroes and vessel, taking them back to New London Harbor in Connecticut. The U.S. Navy, therefore, wanted some part of the result too. It is not certain, but it is thought that Gidney chose New London instead of New York port because slavery was still legal in Connecticut. Furthermore, this meant salvage rights would be considered. Captain Gidney, Lieutenant Meade, and the crew of the USS Washington went further to claim salvage rights to the vessel and its cargo. Not only did the crew and commanders of the USS Washington want salvage rights, but also there was another party claiming these rights as well. Cinque and fellow Africans had tried to communicate with Captain Henry Green and his seamen while on shore. The seamen and Captain Green submitted a libel for salvage, claiming that they had also aided in the capture of the Africans. To start the case, Roger Sherman Baldwin, Seth P. Staples, and Theodore Sedgwick, on the side of the defense, searched for a translator. The first translator found was John Frey from New York, who had originally been a native to the Kissy tribe. Frey was the first to translate that the Mendi Africans on the Amistad were kidnapped from Africa and sold into Havana slavery. With the findings of this information, Secretary of State John Forsyth was pressuring District Attorney Hollibird to make the case have the desired outcome, and at the same time the British government was pressuring Spain to prosecute Ruiz and Montes for their purchasing of medians in violations to their treaties and laws. With all cases present, Judson delivered his decision on January 13, 1840. The final decision had 5 different verdicts. 1. Gidney and all the crew of the USS Washington were entitled to 1/3 value salvage, and then the vessel was to be returned to the Spanish government. 2. The Africans were given no salvage because they had no value as property under any Connecticut law. 3. Captain Green was given no salvage rights based on the fact that neither he nor his seamen ever boarded the Amistad. Antonio, Frere's slave on the Amistad, was to be returned to the rightful owner, Frere's heir, in Cuba. 5. The Africans were neither slaves nor Spanish subjects. Therefore, they were free by law of Spain itself. Judson's rulings said that the Africans were free because they were attempting to free themselves from illegal capture. Therefore, they were found not guilty of murder and piracy. The Amistad and its cargo, not including the African captives, would be returned to Ruiz and Montes. Through Hollibird, the government appealed the decision of the Africans' freedom to the Supreme Court. Knowing that the Supreme Court had 5 Southern justices on the bench, the Christian Missionary Association convinced John Quincy Adams to present the Africans' case. The case of the United States versus Cinque began on February 20th, 1841. The claim was that the slaves aboard the Amistad were guilty of murder and piracy for taking over the ship on which they were being transported. Defending the Africans again was Baldwin, but now accompanied with former President John Quincy Adams. Baldwin restated his statements from the previous case, followed by Adams. John Quincy Adams argued the side of the Africans on February 24th for 4.5 hours. In another 4-hour speech on March 1st, Adams concluded his arguments. In these arguments, Adams went as far as criticizing Van Buren for dictating sympathy in the most partial and unjust ways. In addition, on behalf of the arguments from Spain concerning the Treaty of 1795, Adams stated that the treaty did not include human beings. Justice Joseph Story read the Supreme Court's verdict on March 9, 1841. There was an 8-to-1 vote among the justices to uphold the decision of the lower court. The Supreme Court decided that Pinckney's treaty did not apply because the Africans were not property of Ruiz and Montes. They were kidnapped. The ship's papers submitted by the Spaniards could not be evidence because they were fraud. The crew and commanders of the USS Washington deserved salvage rights, even though possession of the Amistad technically belonged to the Africans when they reached Long Island. Finally, the Africans were entitled to their liberty and free to go wherever they please. They were put in the care of the Amistad Committee, who raised funds until they could pay for the voyage. The ship to Africa set sail on November 27, 1841. 35 Africans were returned to the African coast. The voyage took 7 weeks, ending in Freetown in Sierra Leone.